Alright, so moving along, chapter 2, ready, set, here we go. A paradigm's basically like a worldview. It's a perspective through which we make sense of the world, informed by our norms and values and some assumptions we make about the world. So if you take something like freedom of speech as an example, under the free speech paradigm, we feel pretty secure in expressing ourselves to the extent that much of our identity is actually wrapped up in personal expression. Things we say, what we do, our fashions, slogans that we wear on our t-shirts, how we style our hair, music we sing along to, and so on and so forth, So all of this stuff, the way we express ourselves, tells people who we are and what we're all about. And according to our free speech paradigm, we have every right to be ourselves and to express ourselves. However, under a different cultural paradigm, let's say in rural Pakistan, individual self-expression is not part of that worldview. Instead, people are understood in a far more relational way. You're either somebody's son or daughter or brother or sister or, a cousin or parents or children. The way you express yourself is not an expression of you as an individual necessarily, but an expression of your entire family and your entire community, actually. Therefore, there's more of a politics of respectability in rural Pakistani paradigm than there is, let's say, in an American paradigm. They don't have necessarily this value that they place on free speech, right? And it doesn't make sense in that context. Right? Practice of free speech for a rural Pakistani could actually cause a lot of trouble, not just for the individual, but also for their family and their community. So here's the thing, right? It's very easy to get stuck in your own paradigm. Most of us have lived in North America, pretty much our entire lives. And from that perspective, you might be tempted to say, oh man, those poor Pakistani people, they can't really express themselves. Right? They can't be themselves, and why can't they just be more like us, But that's a mistake, right? And similarly, they may say, oh, those poor American people must be so shallow, thinking only of themselves all the time, and they have no sense of community or ties to family, and that's also a mistake, right? And we should avoid making these kinds of cross-paradigm criticisms. We don't judge another paradigm based on the norms that we apply to our own. Instead, we need to kind of understand the values and assumptions and things that inform that paradigm in order to relate to the people that are in it, right? And so I just wanted to kind of use that as an example, as a way to get into quantitative and qualitative research as paradigms. These are two very different approaches to research. And it's an important point that I'm going to repeat over and over again in this class. Quantitative and qualitative research are not just two different ways of doing research. They're two different ways of thinking about doing research. And the norms and values and assumptions that govern quantitative research don't necessarily apply to qualitative research, and vice versa. So, now most people, as a function of their personality, tend to be more drawn towards one paradigm over the other. So if you enjoy working with numbers and coming to very specific, concrete conclusions, then you're probably going to be more drawn towards a quantitative paradigm or worldview. If you're more interested in sort of an open-ended exploration of people's stories, their experiences, and you're kind of comfortable with some ambiguity in things, then you're probably going to be more drawn to the qualitative side of things. Johnson and Christensen, the textbook authors, they're very clearly quantitative guys, sometimes frustratingly so, in my opinion, especially when we get to some of the qualitative material in the book. Personally, I'm more aligned to the qualitative perspective or paradigm. But it's not really a matter of pledging allegiance and saying everything qualitative is great and anything quantitative is not so great. That's not really how we need to approach research paradigms. Both of the paradigms provide us with very important perspectives on a topic, and they're different perspectives. From a holistic point of view, if you're doing a literature review or reading, about a topic, then yes, you want to have both sides represented. You want to be fully informed about the topic. And whatever your preference is, whether you're quant or qual, you should at least have a firm grounding in the basics of both methodologies so that you understand some of the information that you might come across. Unfortunately, there's been a history of this kind of dismissiveness between the paradigms. This is what was known as the paradigm wars. But in the beginning, or at least since like the Age of Reason, which is about 1700s or so, there was logical positivism, which was the name of the paradigm. And logical positivism relied on objectivity and observable or empirical evidence to understand the mechanics of the universe, which included human behavior. So that's where the whole saying, like, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist, came from, which I don't think is very true or useful. And we also got the scientific method, which is actually quite useful. So logical positivism pretty much ruled research for like hundreds of years. But sometime around like the middle of the 20th century or so, there were critics of logical positivism, and they're pointing out like the limitations of this approach in generating knowledge, particularly where logical positivism was positioned as the sole authority of knowledge. There are other kinds of knowledge that exist, like personal subjective experience, which science wasn't very good at describing. So, drawing on like thinkers from disciplines like literature or philosophy or anthropology was a big one. Journalistic studies, there eventually developed an approach which was called qualitative research, sort of an alternative to the typical quantitative or logical positivist research that had been done for hundreds of years. The establishment, the quantitative researchers, however, weren't very accepting of qualitative research sort of stepping on their turf. They kind of fought back. They accused it of lacking rigor, being junk. Basically, they didn't see a lot of value in people telling stories or, anecdotes and things like that. That was kind of the criticism that was lobbied against the qualitative researchers. And qual researchers, on the other hand, tended to kind of use postmodernism, which we'll talk about later, to deconstruct, sort of the whole process of producing knowledge, how that was sort of tied into power structures and things, which comes out of people like Foucault, who you might have heard of. And it was a means of social control and discipline. So for 20 years, they kind of went back and forth, a lot of bickering and fighting, which, it sounds kind of funny, but, there were serious consequences. Professors, would lose or gain tenure over these kinds of things, and they would bicker back and forth at research conferences and stuff. It was kind of serious for a bit. But by, the late 1980s, early 90s, that whole war had kind of exhausted itself. Most people kind of had reached the point where they said, okay, quantitative and qualitative research both have values. They bring kind of unique and complementary perspectives to a topic. And so we can coexist peacefully, And so that's sort of where things stand today, is we have sort of a peaceful coexistence. If there's one beneficial thing that came from all these paradigm wars, it's that it forced both methodologies to kind of tighten up their rigor and, to admit some of their limitations. So I think probably as a result, we have better versions of quantitative and qualitative research than we would have had maybe 30 or 40 years ago. So now the war is over, right? That's great. What we see now happening now is that there are some researchers who are making attempts to actually unify the two methods under a single sort of mixed methods approach. And it's varying degrees of success. I think there are different opinions about mixed methods, and you're going to find that I'm going to own my opinion right now. I'm skeptical, actually, of mixed methods. I think Johnson and Christensen, the way that they present them, they're too easily dismissive of this incompatibility hypothesis. But there are some valid criticisms that maybe, you as students learning about these approaches should actually consider. So if you open up your text, right, and flip over to table 2.1, you'll see there's three columns. In the first column, I think there's quantitative, and then the mixed methods is in the middle, and then qualitative is on the other side. So if you wanted to just sort of ignore that middle column, you can put a piece of paper over it or something, and just look at quantitative and qualitative. What you'll see is that a lot of that is actually very contradictory. Quantitative operates from a objective perspective, whereas qualitative operates from more of a subjective perspective. Well, how can you be objective and subjective at the same time, right? It doesn't really work. Quant uses numbers, and qual uses more descriptive text. Quant believes that people are regular and predictable. Qualitative believes they're unique and dynamic and contextual. And the thing is, if you try to view the world through a narrow angle lens and a wide angle lens at the same time, that's not going to work. You're only going to end up with blurry vision and a headache, right? So I don't think that they're as compatible as maybe Johnson and Christensen kind of make them out to be. But that's also not to say that you can't combine these methods, that it's impossible. There are actually some quality mixed method studies out there, but they're far more difficult to do than you might suspect. So you shouldn't be fooled by this sort of best of both worlds sales pitch that a lot of advocates of mixed methods often propose. The best of both worlds is really a stupid rationale for doing research or selecting a methodology. But in order to understand why it's stupid, I think we need to look a little bit at the research process. The process of doing a study, if we take it from the very beginning, you're probably going to be interested in a topic, right? There's something that you're curious about, or something that you want to know about, or something you're just interested in, For me, I was interested in working with addicted clients, right? You might be interested in older students who have returned to school, being in the middle of a career change, which is kind of an interesting topic, I think. But you're going to want to do sort of a review of the existing literature to see what's actually been written about it so far, where the research stands presently. So as you're reading, you're learning about the population, you might find you have some questions or curiosities that are coming up for you that haven't been answered by the literature that you're reading. You might be interested in whether second career students, right, are more likely or less likely to complete a bachelor's degree than more traditional students, 18 or 19-year-olds. This is your research question, and this is going to drive everything else in your study. Everything is going to be aimed at answering this question. Therefore, when you select a methodology, you're basically trying to select the methodology that's going to be most appropriate for answering this question. If you've stated your question clearly and correctly, then that's not really a choice. The methodology is not really a choice. It's going to flow naturally from the question that you've asked. So if we take our example of the second career students, right? This is it's a quantitative research question. We have an independent variable, which is the type of student, either the second career student or the traditional student. And we have a dependent variable, which is completion rates, of the undergraduate degree, a bachelor's degree.